So let me start off by making some short comments. I think earlier in Peter's talk, I think he talked about the need to look at integrating various expertise, the pedagogical, the technological part, and the subject expertise all together and try and make it such a way that every part integrates nicely, seamlessly, and so on. But of course, it's easier said than done. And he pointed out some, I suppose, institutional barriers. Traditionally, universities are very focused, and faculty are very focused on research. Research seems to be the big R, and teaching sometimes is treated as a secondary function that you just have to do it because you're in the university. But that's quite wrong, actually. And what can universities do to address this problem? Now, Joseph's presentation has set the stage for the landscape and all the players and so on and so forth, and what are some of the barriers which are already been indicated. So, okay, I would now like to open the panel for questions from our audience. Can I have the first question? Yes, Dan, please.
Yes, so the question is for the gentleman here. Can you point out a case where you've had a very successful transformation exercise and what made it possible? You kind of implied already what it takes, but it would be nice to hear one.
Yeah, thanks for the question. One of the first things, I guess, is having that burning platform. And the burning platform sounds a little bit like jargon, but I guess one of the key things is some event happening. So a lot of the universities, particularly now in developed countries, are very successful. And so, for example, in Australia, the burning platform was the government is taking away funding over the next 2 years. How do you become self-sustainable, and what other areas are you going to invest in order to become sustainable? That's one aspect, and that usually makes higher education institutions change. The other one is driven kind of top-down internally, which is the message is we are very successful, but in order to maintain our competitive positioning, we need to change because there's all these other competitors coming through, and thus we won't be able to offer the same elements in the future, and therefore we need to change. So it's probably a little bit of both external and internal factors influencing that change. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, next question. Well, audience seems to be quite exhausted. Too much information for the day. Maybe let me just come back to this question about, the managing the transformation that technology has brought about, especially in education. What are the real major barriers that you see? What are the major challenges that you think universities should put their mind to try to mitigate these problems? Either of you, maybe Peter can go first.
Is this working? Yes. I think we probably need to accept that the structure of universities needs to change. I think if we don't do that, the existing structure is in and of itself a kind of barrier. I mentioned before about rewards and recognition. I'm beginning to see that as an increasing problem. If we want to encourage technological change at the university, then it needs to be a positive experience for the faculty. It needs to be something that is actually rewarded rather than something that's just required on top of what they're already doing. And as I was saying, I think that then there needs to be a positive vision of what academic identity might be under those new circumstances. I don't think anybody's offered that. I haven't ever seen anybody say, look, this is why we would value your change. This is why we would value you using your expertise in a different kind of way. We talk about how new approaches to teaching are desirable, but I still don't think we've got to the stage where that has infiltrated the actual structure of the university and its reward systems. And so I'd like to see very much a valuing of the kinds of changes that we're looking at. And I haven't seen that happen. And I'm not, by the way, just talking about NTU, I'm talking about everywhere.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. I think moving towards that, there's been a big push into kind of having those incentives and the KPIs around certain change aspects. That's one. The second thing is then the digital program is often treated as a separate transformation to the actual overall university transformation program. So kind of they don't often kind of, one, speak the same language, so they might not be achieving the same goals, and two, they just don't kind of talk or understand each other as well as it should be. So then therefore it's a little bit piecemeal in terms of the digital agenda, which is often one track, and then the overall university agenda, which is another track. And they're often then led by either the CIO on one hand, and then you have the president or chancellor taking care of the strategic change on the other one with the COO. So where we've seen kind of a lot of traction is when they're in a bit of a group together. So when we saw at University of Melbourne, for instance, the top 3 or 4 plus the operations came together as a governance group in order to lead the change together, which created a much stronger narrative in the change than being quite separate. Yeah.
If I can just add to that, I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. And it does seem to, a couple of things you mentioned there. One is people talking the same language. I think it's absolutely true that you very often find that in an ed tech unit, for example, that people are talking a different language from the language that others are speaking. And there's not always mutual comprehension. And there's not always a shared vision of what it means. And I think that you mentioned earlier about having a vision. I think that's absolutely important. And only a few universities I know have actually done that. Said, this is why we're using technology, for example, in our learning. Here's a very clear statement of why it is that we're doing it. Because that helps to bring everybody into the same language, into the same kind of vision. And I think it's very important because it is true that people have different areas of expertise, and if they're in their own echo chamber, they don't kind of hear each other, and I think that needs to change. You see the same patterns, right? You see, when you see different universities, you can see the same things happening across different universities.
Yeah, and I think that because a lot of these institutions have a lot of legacy cultures built in. That's the way that they've operated. And you can see a lot of the transformation. They say kind of in transformation, there's every 5 years when the new president or chancellor comes in, they go the opposite direction of where they did before. And we saw that, say, in Australia, in an Australian uni, where they decentralized. So then they decentralized everything. So all the faculties were allowed to do their own thing and build up their own kind of system and change their own system. So then they all spoke different kind of languages across. And then when the next group came in, it was all about, we now need a central voice in a centralized system. And so you can see that kind of changes every 5 years to 10 years, every decade or so. But getting that common ground is very important.
Just a quick comment to add. I think the reference to a system of incentives and rewards, I think that's very important. And the perception of most faculty is that research is still more highly regarded as opposed to teaching or performance in teaching. And therefore, where should I put my effort to be the most effective for my own progression and career? So I think for universities, I think it has to, somehow the institution have to make sure that it is clear to everyone that teaching and research are equally important in the university context. That the role of a university professor is not just to do research. Of course, that is one of the important functions, and more so for a research-intensive university. But then at the same time, you are preparing the new generation of graduates who are going to graduate into the economy to work and to be productive members of society. So that part is equally important, and it must be somehow made clear to everyone. So yeah, so this is something that I think is important. Okay, let me, I think there's a question from, Naomi.
Yes, thank you. Just about this point on recognition of faculty, and I think it's absolutely crucial that teaching and research are equally valued. But for those faculty who go above and beyond scholarly endeavour in education, I think one thing that's lacking at NTU that other research-intensive universities like Imperial or Harvard or even NUS have a dedicated professorial educator track. And I think one way of recognising academic endeavour in education is through an academic title. And I think that would be quite a powerful incentive for NTU. So I just wondered, for those who are at NTU,
I agree with you, of course. It goes without saying almost. There are alternatives, though, I think, Naomi, as well. I mean, I've tried to think about this a lot because it is a major problem. And I think probably only people working in universities really understand how much of a problem this is. And I can think of various ways of dealing with it. One radical way would be to dispense with the terms research and teaching altogether. And when you go for promotion, for example, that you have a list of criteria which I would call blended criteria, so that the criteria somehow encourage the blending of research and teaching in some way. And you don't actually have, a figure for research and a figure for teaching, because I think having those two things helps to perpetuate the divide. So how to get rid of the divide is for me the question. Another less radical way of doing it, and which a number of universities do, including one that I used to work for, is to have sliding scales, so that you could, for example, have 60% on teaching and then 30 on research and 10 on service. If you chose to have 60% on teaching, you had to be really good. I mean, that then upped all of the criteria. Similarly, you could have 60% on research. Now it didn't vary all that much. And you couldn't go beyond 60% on any particular component. But that's another possible way of doing it, so that you give people who do want to focus on teaching a career path. A career path in scholarly teaching and scholarship of learning and teaching and so on as well.
Okay, can I have a question? Yes, there's one gentleman at the back, please.
Mine would be a simple, quick question, Reality-Nanyang here. I mean, this morning our Dan talked about predicting future, 10, 15 years from now, something will happen, maybe direct neural network lays fit into it. So keeping those kinds of projections in mind, what do you predict in future? Would there be students valuing degrees at all, or degrees and things of that nature will completely disappear? Would there be a need if my thinking works straight from my brain? Would there be enough time to learn and then respond? Or what's your projections 5, 10, 20 years out? Would there be degrees? Would there be no universities? Just a thought-provoking.
Off the top of my head, I would say if that happens, fine. I don't have a problem with it. But I'm not sure that it will. I think there's always going to be some kind of place for a thing that is an educational institution. I think it will change radically. I think it already has changed enormously in the last 20 years, but I think, potentially it will change a great deal. People often say, does this mean that there will no longer be universities? And you can see why people would ask that kind of question. I think probably universities will persist. If you actually go backwards and look at the picture that Dan showed this morning from Bologna, it's painted in the late 13th century, that painting. And if you think that actually that behaviour has persisted in spite of all of the things that might prevent it from happening. You know, the classic thing to say about that picture is that 50 or so years after it was painted, the movable type printing press was invented, which rendered what was happening in that painting rather ridiculous, because in the painting, he's got the only copy of the book. And yet that has persisted throughout, you know, all those hundreds of years. So on that basis, I would say that possibly there's something in the actual notion of the institution that will persist, but it will be very different. And I think it would be stupid of universities if they didn't change and see themselves, like I was saying before, as a single node in a network of learning nodes, rather than as an exclusive place. If you go back to that painting, that's a learning situation as a fairly exclusive learning situation. It's a cloistered situation. And universities started out as cloistered. Then they're no longer cloistered and shouldn't be. But I still think they will persist. That's my prediction. But if they don't, fine.
Yeah, I kind of agree.
I'll be retired anyway.
Yeah, Joseph. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying, yeah, definitely agree with that. I think the institution will exist in some form. It's a really good question and a really privileged question to think about. We do a lot of projects across education and health, and they're saying those two industries are very slow to move, even though there's a lot of technology behind it because of the barriers being, one, doctors and powerful doctor unions in health, and then faculty in education. So that notion of an institution will exist for a little bit. The future of healthcare then, like the chips in the body or education in the body. So if I could learn a new language tomorrow with a chip in the body, I would take that. I would like to do that. And then therefore that would negate the need to go to classes. I think we'll get that at some time, probably not in my lifetime, but it will be there, you know, over time. It's just, can we overcome that resistance to get to that chip in the body, which the technology in healthcare is kind of there for. I don't know in education yet, but probably the next wave of the development of education tech. Yeah.
Thank you, Joseph. I think we have just time for one last question. So anyone like to take that? Okay, the lady over there, please.
Hi, thanks so much for sharing. I'm Kai-Jen, an NTU Year 2 student. So I don't have such an in-depth question. I just curious about two questions. First is that I want to hear some more concrete examples that you mentioned about the university vision. And like you say, there are some universities already have the vision. And I want to hear about that and how the technological transform really fit into that vision. And second is I'm curious about the reward system that you have mentioned. But it's good to establish a reward system, but I'm curious about how to evaluate the professor or the researcher's teaching. Yeah, just from a student's point of view. Thanks.
Okay. In terms of the vision, I probably won't name any universities, but I have spoken to people at a couple of universities where what they did, and I'm thinking now about a university in Malaysia that decided that they wanted to have pretty well 100% technology-enabled learning through all of their through courses. In other words, that every course had some kind of presence. This is going back about 6 or 7 years. And the way they approached it was to, first of all, get all senior management and their, whatever the equivalent of the Senate was, there to talk about what the purpose of this would be. Why would they want to do this, and what do they expect the outcomes to be, or at least what kinds of outcomes would they like to reach? Once they'd done that, they consulted with the students and to get the students on board with their vision and all of the faculty. So they actually had a written vision of what they wanted to do. Then they They got the students on board with it, explained to the students why they wanted to do it and what it was intended to achieve, and did the same with all faculty. So basically they spent the first year getting buy-in from everybody at all the stakeholders at the university. They then implemented this over a period of, and this is kind of enviable, over a period of 2 years. So by the end of 2 years, every single course had some kind of, well, it's hard to define what that would be, but it was, it was some kind of technology enabled learning in each one. So they basically moved the whole of the university to a kind of flipped classroom model in a very short period. And the person who I was speaking to about that said the absolutely essential part of it was having a vision and getting the buy-in for the vision of all of the students and the faculty. It's a kind of model, I think, nice model. In terms of rewards and recognition, I mean, they already exist. There are a number of kinds of things. Obviously, at NTU, people are evaluated every year. They're evaluated for promotion and tenure and so on. There are criteria for that which attach to research, to teaching, and to the admin part of it. And you have to go through a fairly rigorous process. It also includes the student evaluations of teaching that everybody does at the end of every semester. So, there's already a system in place. I'm suggesting that we need to change that system in order to encourage the infusion of the technology.
Joseph, you have anything to add to that?
Just a point just around, I think, the vision is sometimes just hidden as well. So I think the socialization point is really important. The other thing is then the redefining of what your vision is. So that's the other point of it, which is you probably have a vision, but the vision is just not updated to where you are now, which is, I guess, what this conversation is about, which is, do you need to change your vision or strategic way that you're going in order to be relevant in the next 5 to 10 years? And that is often an exercise that doesn't happen because every university will think they'll have a vision at some stages, whether it's now relevant in the course of what's happening from a macro and micro lens. And then now it's getting a bit harder because the universities are so globalized, both in their student cohort and their faculty cohort. So there is a difference in that perspective as well, due to a bit of the globalization and the talent just going to the top universities, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So with that, we'll wrap up this session. So let's thank all our 2 panel speakers for sharing. Thank you very much. Thank you.